Good morning. I hope you all had a good Shabbat. We are here going to be studying chapter 5 of the laws of the foundations of the Torah. So in the past 4 chapters, we have been studying about the greatness of God and about through our contemplation, we can then come to have a love and a fear for God when we think about His greatness and everything that God does and how He is so great in Himself and all His various actions and what He does and in the creation of the world. And the Rambam explained all of this at length. Now we move on to the idea of sanctifying God's name. So we have the essence of the belief in God, and now we're going to be talking about how we have to value this God. So the Rambam is going to be talking in this chapter, chapter 5, all about the idea of sanctification of God's name. So let us begin and we'll get into it. Chapter 5 of the laws of the foundations of the Torah, halacha number 1. The entire house of Israel are commanded regarding the sanctification of God's name. As it says in the verse, "And I shall be sanctified amidst the children of Israel." And we are also warned against the opposite, that we should not, God forbid, desecrate His name. And as it says in the verse, "And they shall not desecrate my holy name." So this is the initial law, the positive commandment that we should sanctify God's name, and then there is the negative commandment that we should not, God forbid, desecrate His name. So the Rambam comes to explain, what does this mean? What does it imply? So should someone come and force a Jew to violate one of the laws of the Torah, whether he's going to make him a lot of pain and torture him if he doesn't do it, or he's going to, God forbid, kill him, so then, in such a case, so then he should violate it. He should violate the mitzvah, if he's going to get killed for it, because it says in the Torah that you should perform the mitzvahs and live by them. So if by performing the mitzvah you're going to die, so then it's better to not perform that mitzvah and live. But and if he does actually die, the Rambam says, if he does say, well, someone is forcing me not to wear my kippah, and he's like, no, I'm going to die, and I'm going to wear my kippah. So he's then going to be held accountable for his life. Because this is not a mitzvah which a person is supposed to give up his life for them. As we will see that there are certain mitzvot that are capital mitzvot, which are different. So, but first of all, he says, when does the above apply? In regards to all the other mitzvot. But when we are talking about these 3 capital mitzvot, which are not to worship other gods, not to serve idols, to engage in forbidden sexual relations, and murder. If we're talking about one of these 3 ideas, one of these 3 concepts, so then a person should rather die than desecrate the name of God by doing the sin. So if a person is forced and said, bow down to this idol, or I'll kill you, or kill this person, or if not, I will kill you, so then the person would rather be killed than to kill that other person. So too also, and there's another exception, in regards to the first laws, in other words, all the regular laws, that when does it apply? When a Gentile is doing this for his own benefit. In other words, this guy is coming and saying, I want you to desecrate Shabbat. But why is he doing it? Just because he feels like it. For whatever reason that his own personal explanation why he wants this to happen. But if he is doing this only in order that he should violate that mitzvah, If he is in the presence of 10 people or more, so then he should rather be killed than to desecrate, even if it's a simple mitzvah. Because over here, this is the essence, it's the symbol of God's name. It's the idea of any mitzvah. Because he doesn't, it's not that he wants him to desecrate it just because he needs him to work and he says, well, if you're not going to work on Shabbat, well then, I'll knock you out. But rather, it's just for, he wants him that he should be doing this sin only for the mere purpose that he should desecrate God's name. So in such a case, if there is people watching, he should rather be killed and sanctify God's name. And all of this is also only applicable in regular times, but in a time when it is a decree, in other words, in a time when there is a ruler who is persecuting the Jewish people, in a time of war, etc., when it's not a good time for the Jewish people, and they are under the decrees of other nations. So then, if they have a decree, the king or whoever, the ruler, dictator says that a certain mitzvah is not allowed to be done, let's say Brit Milah, as it has been throughout history, or keeping Shabbat, etc. So then, in such a case, the person should rather lose his life than to not fulfill that commandment of Hashem, because again, it's all with the idea, the reason why this dictator has done this is in order to desecrate God's name solely for this purpose. So therefore, it is a Jew's responsibility to sanctify God's name, to continue doing this mitzvah, although he is being told not to do it by another human being. So that's the basic of the mitzvah. Now he continues on by saying that a person where it says that if a person who it says that he should do the sin, in a case where it says that he should do the sin, and he hasn't done it, but instead he got killed, so then he says again that he is held accountable for his life. And if he does this in the presence of 10 people, if a person is forced to do a certain action, a certain sin, God forbid, and it's one of the capital mitzvot, or it's in the presence of 10 Jews, so it's becoming a big deal, and he's forced to do the sin, and he says, I will not do it, and he ends up losing his life, this person has sanctified God's name. He has made God great. As we find throughout history, many great people who have they went through the hardest and the harshest, and in the end losing their life just for the mere fact that they were Jewish people. And they are regarded in the highest of esteem. They go to the highest place in heaven, it says. And it's such an honorable concept that the person who has stuck to his belief just for the mere fact of believing in God, that's why he was killed. It's a very special thing. But we find that Rabbi Akiva, for instance, had this, and it says that the verse says in Psalms, gather unto me my pious ones, those who have made a covenant with me by slaughter. So these are the ones that have given up their life just because they believe in God. But then, if a person who was supposed to, die instead of doing this sin, but instead he does this sin, and he doesn't give up his life for it, so then he has desecrated God's name. He has desecrated God's name, and if it's within the people watching, and there is more than 10 people, so then it's counted as if it's in public, and he desecrated God's name in public. So that's quite a terrible thing. But on the other hand, because he was forced, so he doesn't get punished by it, because the person is only punished in a case where he does a sin on his own account. In other words, he does it by his own will. But if he's forced into it, so then he is not accountable for it. But although he has desecrated God's name, which is a terrible thing. But if he's able to escape, he should definitely escape. And if he doesn't escape, that's pretty bad. Now he moves on to a little bit of slightly of a different type of scenario, where you have a bunch of people somewhere, in a room, in a place, and someone comes over and, and he says, so let's say over here in this case, he says there's a group of women, and the guy comes and says, give me one of the women to defile her, and if not, we will defile you all. So the Rambam says, you do never give someone over. You never officially give someone to be defiled, to be killed. In other words, the Rambam says, better that they should all be defiled than specifically giving over one person. And if it's a case where he wants to kill, where someone, says, I'm going to kill you all if you don't give me one of you. So then again, you don't give anyone. You don't give anyone over. You don't pass it. You don't pass them over. You don't let them, But if he specifies that specific person, he names him by name, and he says, give me that person, and if not, I'm going to kill you all. So, for the most part, the law is exactly the same. But the Rambam says that if it's a case where we have found throughout history that there were cases where such a thing might have taken place, and that person was someone who because of his sins was supposed to die, so then they passed him over. But again, that's something which is not usually in our understanding to decide, and I hope that no one ever gets into such a situation. But if, God forbid, it does take place, a person is not allowed to pass over and give someone else to be killed in order to save their own life. In the same way this works in regards to someone being forced to do a sin and because of someone who wants to kill him, etc. It also applies in regards to sicknesses. If a person is sick, and now this sickness is actually the murderer, it's going to be killing him. And only through taking certain medications or doing certain actions he's going to become healthy. So then it depends. If we're talking about a regular commandment, let's say to keep Shabbat, or so on and so forth. So if a person who is very sick and he could die because of this sickness, and if he's going to keep Shabbat, he might just die because of that, because we have to bring him the medication, and so we need someone to desecrate Shabbat to go bring him that. So then that is allowed, and that actually is something that happens all the time. For instance, if a woman is giving birth, so that's looked upon according to Jewish law as something which could be life-threatening. God forbid it shouldn't get there, but it technically could. So a woman who is giving birth, she's allowed to go into a car and being driven to the hospital. So that's definitely something which happens all the time. There's actually a story of a rabbi, who was living in New York, smack in the middle of Brooklyn. And right before Shabbat, as he was getting out of the car before Shabbat, he parks it in his garage, and his windows are open, and the radio, his kid was playing with the radio and it was on full blast, but he just turned off the car. He didn't think twice. And then the next day his wife was giving birth, so he jumps into the car and to go to the hospital, and his windows are open and the radio is blasting. But you're only allowed to do what is important and what is needed for the sick person. So to turn on the car and drive and go to the hospital, that he was supposed to do. That he's allowed to do. But just for his own comfort of turning off the radio, that's not something which he's allowed to do. So, turns out he's driving through the streets of Brooklyn with his windows open, with the radio blasting, and everyone's like looking, oh my God, what happened to this rabbi? So, but that's something which takes place. It happens. But if we're talking about the three capital laws, the laws of we're talking about murder, forbidden sexual relations, and idol worship, So if it's one of those three, in other words, if we have to kill someone else in order to save this person, that's not something which we're allowed to do. And as it says in the verse, you should love God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. With all your soul, implying that even if God takes away your soul, if your soul is taken away because of your love of God, because of your performance of God's will, you should still do what God wants, if it's talking about these three capital laws. So all of this is only applicable in a case where it's dangerous. When there is a danger, the person is able to die. But if it's a person who is not going to be dying because of this, he's just not feeling well, so then we're not allowed to desecrate a mitzvah in order to make him feel a little bit better. Then the Rambam continues to say, there's a special law in regards to a specific case. If there is a person who was very, very much in love with a certain woman, but this woman didn't specifically like this guy. And now, the guy loves her so much, he's so much in love, that he's becoming sick because of it. And he's in bed. And the doctor says, this guy is dying. If he's not going to marry this woman, he's going to die. He's so deeply in love. So then, the Rambam says, we do not let him get close to this woman. We don't even let him talk to her, so that that Jewish women and girls should not be regarded capriciously, and to prevent these matters from spiraling down somewhere where we don't want to go. So we don't let this person look and talk and engage with this person at all. So that we should keep things good and well. If a person consciously transgresses one of the mitzvot of the Torah, one of the commandments, without being forced to do so, just to arouse anger, so on and so forth, so then it says about this person that he has desecrated the name of God, and if it was done within the midst of 10 people, so then he desecrates God's name in public. And so too also, if a person doesn't do a sin and he performs a mitzvah instead, and not for any personal gain or anything, but because God has told him to do so, so then he sanctifies God's name. And if it's done within more people, 10 people, so then he sanctifies God's name in public. Just as we find that Joseph sanctified God's name by withholding himself back from his master's wife in the famous story in the Torah, where his master's wife was trying to force him into sexual relations with her, and he held himself back and he ran away from it. So over here we see that Joseph sanctified God's name. And then the Rambam completes this chapter in halacha number 11, in paragraph number 11, where he says the following, that there are also things which are not necessarily sins, and they're not necessarily capital sins, but they are things that a person a person of stature, a person who, a Torah scholar, etc., a person who is renowned for his piety, should be very careful and not do these things. For instance, if a person buys something, he should pay for it up front. Not that he takes things on credit, and then you have all different people that he owes money to, and so on, and it's not a nice situation. Or to be very much laughing very, very loud, or to eat and drink a lot in a very low fashion, or to be very angry person, or to fight a lot. But rather, a person should receive other people in a very kind way, and he should always be very careful of the other person's feeling, and he should always talk nicely to other people. And even if someone embarrasses him, he shouldn't embarrass people back. And he should always do business properly in a very good way and without cheating people, God forbid. And he should always be, put on his tefillin, and he should be studying. And a person should live their life in a way that where people look at them and they say, oh, this is someone who, is sanctifying God's name. People who he is loved, and ultimately God will love him. And as it says in the verse, Israel, you are my servant, in whom I will be glorified. And that verse will refer to such a person who is glorifying God's name by his actions and by the way of his life. With that, my friends, we complete today's chapter 5. And I wish you all a very good day. And we will be in touch, God willing, tomorrow for chapter number 6.